This happened a few years ago. My buddy Pete and I were looking for a new hiking trail. This was right at the beginning of summer when everyone else was going out into the woods around our area. We didn't want to join them, so we were looking for a little-known trailhead, something off the beaten path. We finally found it. It was a tiny dirt road leading into the woods not too far from an abandoned village. The place had been evacuated due to some environmental disaster. I never found out what really happened there. Something about toxic waste leaching into the groundwater. Either way, this place was pretty much off limits. There was a little clearing at the end of the dirt road where the trail started. It was maybe 20 by 30 feet, and smack dab in the middle was a weathered wooden sign. As soon as I saw it, I knew it was handmade. It just felt wrong. The wood looked like it had come from a telephone pole or something like that, and the paint was chipping off in big flakes. The sign read, "Beware, trespassers will be cursed." There was a crude drawing of a man with horns underneath. Pete and I laughed it off. Some kids probably did it for a dare. But then we realized there were no tire tracks leading to the sign. And the only other tracks belonged to some deer. We were the only people here. Pete decided to make a joke of it. He took a stick and pretended to cast a spell on me. "By the power of the horned man, you are now cursed," he shouted. Then he broke the stick over his knee and threw it into the forest. "Oh my God," I said, trying to play along. "What do I do?" Pete shrugged. "You're on your own, bucko. The horned man works in mysterious ways." And with that, we started down the trail. It wasn't long before we heard the first scream. It sounded like a woman, but it was so distorted it could have been anything. A cat, a dog, I don't know. It came from deep within the forest and it echoed through the trees. Pete and I exchanged a look, but neither of us said a word. We kept walking. A little further up the trail, we found an old fire pit. It was clearly man-made, but judging by the surrounding foliage, it hadn't been used in a while. We decided to pitch our tent nearby, mostly because it was getting late and there were still a few hours of daylight left. As soon as our tent was set up, Pete started a fire. We took turns feeding sticks into the flames, all the while keeping an ear out for any more screams. An hour passed, then another. We didn't hear anything. Pete and I were starting to think we were being ridiculous. The whole cursed thing was most likely just a prank. But then Pete spotted something in the branches above our campsite. At first he thought it was an animal, but it didn't move. It just sat there. Pete strained to get a better look. "What the hell?" he whispered. "That's a bone." Sure enough, hanging from a low branch was a human femur. It was small, probably a child's. Pete and I stared at it, frozen in fear. Then, without saying a word, Pete grabbed the bone and threw it into the fire. We watched as it caught fire and turned to ash. "I think we should go home," I said, my voice cracking. Pete nodded, but we both knew we couldn't leave just yet. We had to finish the fire. So we fed more sticks onto the blaze until the remaining branches were burnt to ash. When we finished, the sky was filled with stars. Pete and I packed up our gear. Then we started down the trail. Every crackle and snap of the forest sent shivers down my spine. Every gust of wind made me jump. The full moon offered little comfort. Its pale light did little to penetrate the thick canopy overhead. The deeper we went, the thicker the trees became. Soon the branches formed a wall above us, blocking out the moonlight. It was pitch black. Pete's flashlight flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows all around us. We stumbled over roots and rocks. The forest floor was a tangled mess of dead leaves and broken branches. Then we heard it again, a blood-curdling scream. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Pete and I froze. We listened intently, straining to hear any other sounds, but there was nothing. The silence was deafening. Suddenly, 2 points of light appeared in the darkness ahead of us. They were coming closer. I could feel their burning gaze upon us. Pete and I huddled together, terrified. Then the light was gone. Whatever it was, it had passed right by us. We didn't stop running until we reached our tent. I collapsed inside, shaking uncontrollably. Pete joined me, his face pale as a sheet. "What was that?" I whispered. "I don't know," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "But whatever it is, it's following us." We spent the rest of the night in the tent. Every time we heard a noise, we huddled together and waited for it to pass. By morning, we were exhausted and terrified. We didn't sleep at all. When the sun finally rose, we unzipped the tent and climbed out. The forest was silent. The only sound was the chirping of birds. Slowly, we began to calm down. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice still shaking. Pete nodded and we started to pack up. But as I reached for my backpack, I noticed something in the grass nearby. It was a human skull. Pete and I stared at it in horror. Then we started to scream. We ran as fast as we could, crashing through the underbrush. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. As I drove away, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was tall and thin, and it seemed to be made of shadows. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and we sped away. We never went back to that forest. Pete and I haven't spoken much since that day. Not because of what we experienced, but because I can't look him in the eyes. I can't look anyone in the eyes. Sometimes I think I'm going crazy. It's been years, but I still hear the screams in my nightmares. I still feel the burning gaze of those eyes upon me. And sometimes when I'm all alone, I think I hear whispers in my ear, just barely audible. If I strain to listen, they become clear. "Get away," they hiss. "Heed our warning. You are cursed." Sometimes I think I can feel something inside of me, something cold and evil, growing stronger every day. And sometimes when I look in the mirror, I think I see a shadow lurking behind me, waiting to pounce. One day I'll go back to that forest. I have to, but I know whatever I find will change me forever. I recently took a solo trip out into the woods to try to disconnect from all the stress of life and get away from my phone and other technology. But I think I may have gotten more than I bargained for when I came across an abandoned campsite that was far from abandoned. It was a Thursday afternoon when I decided to head out to the forest. I grabbed my backpack, made sure everything was in it, including a sleeping bag, a pillow, some clothes, a lighter, and some food. And then I headed out the door. I've been to this forest many times before with friends, but never alone. It's about a 2-hour hike to the site that I'm going to be staying at. So I began to make my way deeper and deeper into the woods, excited to spend some time alone. About 45 minutes in, I started to hear what sounded like whispering. At first, I just brushed it off as the wind and continued on my merry way. But as I got closer and closer to the site, I started to hear what sounded like footsteps. I couldn't make out if they were getting closer or further away. I couldn't tell if there were multiple people or just one, but I could have sworn I heard voices and footsteps replying to me. But when I finally got to the site, everything seemed okay. There was a nice little clearing where I could pitch my tent and set up camp. The previous campers had left a fire pit with some logs still warm from their fire, and their food was out beside their tent. All of their gear was still there as well, but there was no sign of them anywhere. At this point, I felt a bit uneasy, but I assumed that they had probably just gone for a walk and would be back any minute, so I decided to stay. I pitched my tent not too far from the fire pit. I pulled out my sleeping bag and laid down and started to get comfortable. As the sun began to set, I noticed that the forest surrounding me seemed to be getting darker and darker. Then I remembered that there was a flashlight in the car. I didn't bring it with me because I never thought I would need it. I got up and walked over to my backpack and started digging through it to find my headlamp. I must have left it in the car though, because I couldn't find it anywhere. At this point, it was completely dark and I was starting to get really scared. I knew that my phone had no signal out here, so I was completely alone. I sat there in the darkness for a few minutes trying to calm myself down. I tried to reason with myself that I was probably just being paranoid and that everything was going to be fine. Then I started to hear the whispers again. They seemed to be coming from everywhere. and nowhere at the same time. I told myself it was probably just the wind and tried to go back to sleep, but the whispers kept getting louder and more frequent. At this point, I started to hear footsteps near my camp. Whatever was out there was getting closer and closer. I don't know how long I sat there listening to whatever was out there, but eventually the sound stopped and I went to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to what sounded like my tent being ripped apart. I started screaming and making tons of noise, and whatever was out there stopped. I stayed in my tent shaking and crying until the morning, at which point I unzipped it to the creepiest scene. My stuff had been moved. My backpack, which had been sitting right beside my tent, was now in the middle of the clearing. My sleeping bag, which had been zipped up and tucked inside of my backpack, was unzipped and laying flat, and the pillow that had been inside of the backpack with the sleeping bag was sitting beside the tent. And that's when I noticed the first note. Someone had written on a piece of paper, "Don't turn around." I quickly picked up my stuff and ran as fast as I could to my car, practically tripping over myself in my haste to get away. When I got back to the car, I noticed another piece of paper on my windshield. On it was written, "He sees you." I got in my car and slammed the door, at which point I noticed that the backpack was once again in the passenger seat. I had distinctly remembered putting it in the back when I had run out of the woods. I turned on the car and sped out of there, not stopping until I reached the highway. Even now, after telling this story to countless people, most of whom are very close to me, none of them believe me. Some say that I should have just stayed in the tent. Others say I should have ran to the nearest house instead of to my car. I think that I was just exhausted and being paranoid, but sometimes I wonder if I was being watched the whole time. That's why I've never returned to that forest. I can't help but wonder if what I experienced was a warning of some kind. After I posted my last video about the abandoned cabin that I found in the woods, I received quite a few messages from people saying that they had also found similar cabins in the woods, and I asked if they would like me to make a video about them. In this video, I will share some of those stories with you, and I will also share some of my own experiences. If you would like me to make a video about your experience, please send me a message and I will do my best to incorporate it into one of my future videos. The first story comes from a viewer who says that he was hiking with a friend when he came across a small cabin. He said that the cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years, and that it appeared to be in the middle of nowhere. He and his friend decided to explore the cabin, and they soon realized that someone had been living there recently. They found signs of a fire, and they also found some food. The viewer said that he and his friend were getting a bit scared at this point, but they decided to stay the night in the cabin anyway. In the middle of the night, they heard what sounded like screams in the forest. They couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but it sounded like it was right outside of the cabin. They stayed in the cabin until the morning, and then they ran as fast as they could to their car. They never looked back to see if whatever was out there was following them. Another viewer sent me a similar story about a cabin that she found in the woods with her sister. She said that they had been hiking for hours and that they were starting to get a bit lost. They then came across a small cabin and they decided to go inside. The cabin was dark and dusty and it smelled like mildew. They could tell that someone had been living there recently, but they didn't see anyone. They decided to stay in the cabin for the night, and in the middle of the night, they heard what sounded like footsteps in the attic above them. They stayed in the cabin until the morning, and then they ran as fast as they could to their car. They never looked back to see if whatever was in the attic was following them. The next story comes from a viewer who says that he was camping with his friends when he saw what looked like a small shack in the distance. He said that it looked like it had been abandoned for years, but he couldn't help but feel curious about it. So he decided to go over and take a look. When he got closer, he realized that it was actually a small wooden hut. He knocked on the door and a woman's voice called out, "Who's there?" He was startled and he quickly backed away from the hut. He said that he could have sworn that the woman had been inside the hut a moment ago, but now it looked like it had been empty for years. He ran back to his campsite as fast as he could, and he never looked back to see if the woman was following him. The last story comes from a viewer who says that he was hiking with his dog when he came across a small cottage. He said that the cottage looked like it had been abandoned for years, but he could have sworn that he saw a light in one of the windows. He decided to go over and investigate, and as he got closer, he could hear what sounded like voices coming from inside the cottage. He peeked through a window and he saw a group of people sitting around a table talking. He said that he was frozen in place and that he couldn't move or make a sound. The people inside the cottage continued to talk, and they didn't seem to notice him at all. After a few minutes, he was able to break free from his stupor and he ran as fast as he could to his car. He never looked back to see if the people were following him. I found these stories fascinating and I couldn't help but wonder if they were true. I decided to research each of the locations to see if I could find any evidence that they had actually been abandoned. I was surprised to find that each of the locations did in fact exist and that they were all in remote areas of the country. I couldn't help but wonder if there was something sinister behind each of these abandoned places. If you have ever experienced anything similar, please let me know in the comments below. And if you would like me to make a video about your experience, please send me a message. I went missing for 3 days during a camping trip, but when I finally got back to camp, my friends swore I had only been gone for a few hours. It was just me and 3 of my best friends. We decided to go camping in a national park about 4 hours away. It's a place we all knew well. We had driven through it dozens of times and hiked its trails many times before, so none of us really thought much of it. We set up camp at our usual spot near a lake and spent the day swimming, hiking, and just relaxing. That night we made dinner over the fire and told stories like we always did. The other 3 tents were pitched in a circle around our tent with about 20 or 30 feet between each one. Our site was fairly secluded, so even if people walked by, they would have to be very close to us to see inside our tent. And the last thing I remember that night was the 3 of them joking around outside the tent while I slept. Then, around AM, I heard what sounded like screams in the forest, loud enough to make me jump out of bed. My heart started racing and I looked over at the other tents to see if any of them were moving. I don't know why. I thought this would make a difference, but it did. I felt a little better knowing that whatever it was that had made the noise hadn't disturbed anyone else. I tried to go back to sleep, but I kept hearing these rustling noises near our tent. At first it sounded like they were coming from outside the tent. Then it sounded like they were coming from inside. I sat up in bed and started listening intently. The sounds were definitely coming from inside the tent. Whatever it was small and dragging itself along the tent, slowly climbing over the mesh. I started yelling and making tons of noise myself, and the sound stopped abruptly. I started to calm down, but then I heard a thump on the tent followed by heavy footsteps running away. I immediately grabbed my flashlight and started shining it around the tent looking for anything, anybody. Of course, I found nothing. The sun was rising by then, so I figured it was probably just some sort of large animal that had gotten into the tent. I unzipped the door a bit further and stuck my head out to scan the area. As I was doing this, I must have blacked out because the next thing I remember is waking up on the ground far away from camp. When I realized what had happened, I started freaking out. I was completely lost, had no idea where I was, and had no gear with me. I had only been camping for 1 night and I never carry extra water or food when I go camping. Within an hour, I started getting really scared. I tried calling out for help, but nobody answered. I continued walking until I came across a road and started hitchhiking. A nice couple offered me a ride into the nearest town, and that's where I called my friends to come pick me up. But when I told them I had been missing since the night before and gave them my description of what had happened, they didn't believe me. They said they had barely fallen asleep when I started screaming in the night. They looked outside and saw that one of the tents was torn open and there was a hole in the mesh big enough for a person to crawl through. But they didn't think much of it. They assumed that it was a bear and that I had probably just woken up and wandered off on my own somewhere. They only realized the next morning that I was missing. So they had only been looking for me for a few hours. They said they searched everywhere and couldn't find me anywhere. Then they drove past the tent site and saw my backpack, which they brought back with them. So they dropped everything and came to look for me again. And that's when they found me sitting on the side of the road. They asked me how I had managed to get so far away from camp in the middle of the night. I honestly had no idea. I don't remember anything after leaving the tent. They checked my phone and it had no battery, so they charged it up, and that's when they found the photo. When I regained consciousness on the road, I had no idea where I was. I was disoriented, scared, and confused, and then I noticed several long, thin marks down my arm and across my chest. I don't know exactly what they were. They weren't scratches, but they weren't bruises either. I still have them, by the way. So my friends and I have been over this entire story countless times, and we can't figure out what the hell happened to me. It doesn't make sense. How could I have walked miles away from camp in the middle of the night and not remembered a single second of it? And here's the most disturbing part. When I looked at the photo on my phone, I instantly recognized where it was taken. It was right where I had woken up on the road. But the photo wasn't taken the next morning when I woke up and started walking. It had been taken the night before at 4:23 a.m. That was the exact time that I heard the commotion in the tent. And here's another detail that really freaks me out. I distinctly remember shoving my phone into my pocket and putting my hand over it as if I was trying to shield it from something. It wasn't a dream because I still have the dents in my pocket from where my phone was. Why would I have protected my phone like that unless I knew something was coming to take it? Like I knew something was going to attack me and take my phone. Also, why would something have attacked me and then left? There was absolutely nothing valuable inside my tent. It wasn't like a bear or a mountain lion that wanted to eat me. So why would it stop attacking me once I left? It would have made more sense if I had been completely drained of energy and then it finished me off, took my stuff and left. Oh, and here's another thing that I forgot to mention earlier. When I ran out of the tent to check on what was going on, I must have dropped my hat in the process because I found it later lying on the ground beside the tent. But the disturbing thing about it is that it had been turned inside out. My friends say that it is probably best that we don't know what happened to me that night, that whatever attacked me, it probably wouldn't hesitate to attack one of them too. I guess I agree. I mean, I'm just glad I survived, but sometimes when I think about what happened, I get the feeling that something came back with me that night, something that may not be entirely friendly.